This man is remembered as the greatest traitor in history. The name no one wants to carry. The face that everyone condemns without thinking twice. The one who sold Jesus for a few pieces of silver. Judas. For centuries, his story has been told in only one way, as if there were no doubt, as if everything was crystal clear, as if his destiny was marked solely by betrayal. But there's something about this story that doesn't quite add up. Because if Judas was truly the worst of them all, then why did Jesus choose him from the very beginning? It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. He wasn't someone who just showed up later. He walked with him. He heard every teaching. He witnessed every miracle. He was present in every important moment. And yet, Jesus never pushed him away. He never exposed him in front of the others. He never pointed at him as the enemy. He never stopped him. And that raises an uncomfortable question. Because if Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen and still allowed Judas to be there, then are we really watching a betrayal? Or are we witnessing something that was always meant to happen? Because what looks like a human decision might also be part of a much larger plan. And if that's true, then maybe, just maybe, Judas wasn't exactly what we've always been told. And that's where everything starts to change. When his name is mentioned, the reaction is instant. Traitor. No doubt, no analysis, no context, just one word that defines everything. Judas is the man who sold Jesus, the one who betrayed him with a kiss, the one who traded loyalty for money. That's how the story is told over and over again. From a young age, we're taught that he was the worst, the fake disciple, the one who walked with the truth and still chose darkness. Because he wasn't a stranger, he wasn't an outsider, he wasn't someone who didn't know what he was doing. He was one of the 12, one of the closest, one of those who ate with him, one of those who heard every word with no filter. And yet, he betrayed him. That's why his name became forever marked, not just as a warning, but as a symbol. The symbol of what you should never do. The example of what happens when someone sees the truth and still rejects it. And the story seems closed. Judas was the villain, the traitor, the guilty one. End of story. But here's the curious part. Even though everyone repeats the same thing, very few people stop to think deeper. Was it really that simple? Or are we only seeing one part of the story, the part we've always been told? Because when a story seems too clear, sometimes that's exactly when the most important things are left unseen. And maybe, just maybe, Judas is not as easy to understand as he seems.
Now, if we set aside what everyone says and look at what actually happened, things start to look different. Yes, it's true. Judas was the one who handed him over. He was the one who went to the religious leaders. He was the one who pointed out Jesus. He was the one who identified him with a kiss. That cannot be denied. But pause for a moment right there, because that part is always told so quickly, as if there was nothing more to see, as if everything ended with that decision. And it doesn't. Because before that, Judas wasn't a stranger. He didn't appear at the end of the story. He wasn't an infiltrator. He wasn't an outsider. He was chosen, out of many. Jesus called him knowing exactly who he was. He walked with him the entire time. He saw what no one else saw. He heard what few others heard. And yet, he was never removed. He was never replaced. He was never publicly confronted. That alone is strange, because if someone knew that one of their own was going to betray them, the normal thing would be to stop them, to distance them, to expose them. But here, none of that happened. Judas remained there until the very end. And then there's another detail: the money. We're always told he did it for money, 30 pieces of silver. It sounds simple. It sounds like greed. It sounds like a cheap betrayal. But would someone who had been so close to Jesus, who had seen everything he did, who had heard everything he said, really trade all of that for a few coins? Is that truly the full reason? Or is that just the easiest way to explain it without looking any deeper? Because there's more. When everything happens, when Jesus is arrested, when the consequences become real, Judas doesn't celebrate. He doesn't hide satisfied. He doesn't move on like nothing happened. Instead, he does something that completely breaks the image of the cold traitor. He repents. He returns the money. He rejects it. He throws it away, as if he never wanted it, as if that was never the point. And that changes the entire tone of the story. Because someone who acts out of pure evil doesn't come back, doesn't break down, doesn't try to undo what they did. But Judas did. And suddenly, everything becomes more uncomfortable, because it no longer fits so neatly. He's no longer just the bad guy. He's someone who made a decision and then couldn't live with it. And that opens a crack, because if he was only a traitor, why did he break afterwards? And if he broke, then what was really going on inside him? Because maybe the story isn't as simple as selling and betraying. Maybe there's something more, something that isn't visible at first glance. But here is where everything starts to fall apart, because up to this point, it still fits the story we know. He betrays, he repents, and he pays the price. That seems clear. But there's one question that changes everything. What if Judas wasn't acting alone? Not in the sense of outside influence, but in the sense of purpose. Because long before it happened, it was already spoken about. A handover, a betrayal, someone close. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't unexpected. It was something that had to happen. And if that's true, then someone had to do it. Someone had to play that role. Someone had to be there at that exact moment. And that someone was Judas. So the story is no longer comfortable. Because if it was all part of something much bigger, was Judas really breaking the plan? Or was he fulfilling it? Because Jesus didn't just know. He said it. He spoke about it. He said that one of them would betray him. He mentioned it before it even happened. And yet, he did nothing to stop it. He didn't avoid it. He didn't replace him. He didn't stop him. He let it happen. And that's what feels uncomfortable. Because if you know someone is going to do something so serious and you still allow it, then the story stops being only about guilt. It becomes about function, about a role inside something much bigger. And then the question becomes inevitable. Did Judas choose to betray? Or was he simply the missing piece needed for everything to unfold? Because without Judas, there is no handover. Without the handover, there is no trial. Without the cross, there is no story as we know it. So, how free was his decision really? And how necessary was his act? Because if all of this was already written, if the betrayal wasn't a surprise, if it was part of something that had to be fulfilled, then the story is no longer as simple as Judas decided to betray. Because something doesn't add up. Jesus knew what was going to happen, not just in general, but
but in detail. He knew one of his own would hand him over.
He knew who it would be. He knew how it would happen. And yet, he kept him close. He didn't push him away. He didn't replace him. He didn't change the course. That is key. Because when someone has the power to prevent something and chooses not to, we're no longer talking about a simple human mistake. We're talking about something that was permitted. And that completely changes the perspective. Because then Judas stops being just the one who broke everything and starts to look like the one who activated it. And here comes the uncomfortable part. If no one handed Jesus over, how would he reach the cross? If no one pointed him out, how would they arrest him? If no one took that step, how would what had already been said come to pass? Someone had to do it. And that someone was Judas. So the question is no longer whether it was right or wrong. The question is whether it was inevitable. Because if it was inevitable, then Judas wasn't outside the plan. He was inside it. And that's what breaks the traditional narrative. We were taught to see him as the enemy, but at this point, he looks more like a piece. An uncomfortable piece, yes, but a necessary one. Now, careful. This doesn't mean he didn't make choices. It doesn't mean he had no responsibility. He did choose. He did walk that path. He did take that step. But here's the nuance almost no one wants to see. Choosing something doesn't always mean that thing is outside a greater purpose. Sometimes human decisions fit into something much bigger, even if the person doesn't understand it. And Judas seems to be right at that point, because his story doesn't end like someone who wins. There is no glory. There is no reward. There is no pride. There is only brokenness. There is guilt. There is weight. There is a reaction that doesn't match someone who simply did evil and moved on. And that forces us to rethink everything. Because if he had truly been a cold traitor, why didn't he just keep going? Why didn't he justify himself? Why didn't he protect himself? Instead, he collapses, like someone who did something he couldn't carry. And that opens another possibility. Not the one of a flat villain, but of someone who became part of something that was bigger than him. And here is where the story becomes more complex. Because if Judas was necessary, but at the same time responsible, then he doesn't fit into any simple category. He's not just the bad guy, but he's also not innocent. He's something harder to accept. Someone who did what had to happen, but paid the full price for doing it. And that's what makes it uncomfortable. It breaks the idea of black and white. It leaves us in a place where it's no longer so easy to judge. Because if you had been in that position, with that pressure, at that exact moment, would you have done anything different? Or maybe it would have happened anyway. Because maybe Judas isn't just a story of the past. Maybe he's an uncomfortable reflection of what can happen when a human decision intersects with something far greater than we can understand.
And that's where everything changes. So, we reach the point where it's no longer easy to answer. Because if you look at it the way you were always told, Judas is the traitor, the one who sold him, the one who failed, the one who shouldn't have done what he did. But if you look at everything else, the things that aren't said as often, the uncomfortable parts, the story begins to shift. Because it no longer looks like a simple act of evil. It looks like a decision inside something much bigger, something that had to occur. And that leaves a difficult question that's hard to ignore. Because if it was all part of a plan, if everything was leading to that moment, then Judas wasn't just the one who betrayed. He was the one who made everything move forward. And that doesn't make him good, but it also doesn't make him as clearly evil. It leaves him in an uncomfortable place, a place where you can no longer judge so quickly. Because yes, he made a decision, but that decision also fit exactly into what had to happen. And that's where everything breaks. Because then, you're no longer just seeing a traitor, you're seeing someone who did what was necessary, even if the cost was himself. And maybe that's why his story weighs so heavily, because it's not easy to accept, it's not comfortable, it's not clear. And that's exactly why it continues to create the same doubt. So now, the question is no longer the same as always. It's no longer just, was Judas the bad guy? The real question is, was Judas guilty, or was he an instrument? Was it betrayal, or was it part of something inevitable? And that answer is no longer as obvious as it seems. Now it's your turn. What do you see when you look at this story? If you made it this far, it's because something inside you isn't completely sure anymore. Because this story that once seemed so clear doesn't feel the same. And that's exactly what matters. Not staying with what you were always told, but daring to look deeper. Because in the end, it's not just about Judas. It's about how we judge, how quickly we point fingers, how easily we label someone without questioning anything else. And now that you've seen both sides, you can't look at it the same way again. So, I want to read you, but not with a lukewarm answer, not with an I don't know, not with a middle ground. Take a stand. Decide. Was Judas guilty, or was he an instrument? Was he a traitor, or was it necessary? Write it clearly, just one word: guilty or instrument. Because that's where the real conversation begins. And the more people who participate, the further this message reaches, to people who may never have stopped to think about this before. So write your answer below and tell me, how do you judge this story now?